Thank you, Craig, for the invitation to be part of this discussion. I will be brief because I know there'll be lots of questions after the rich contributions we've already heard tonight. As I was reading Craig's paper ahead of this evening, I was reminded of a Sunday Times review of two books by the New Testament historian Geza Vermes. The reviewer wrote, quote, "Jesus' main concern was healing the sick, comforting the poor, and preaching about the coming of the kingdom of God. He had no interest in politics, revolution, or theology," end quote. The idea that kingdom is not a political term, that God is not a theological term, and about preaching the coming of the kingdom is not a revolutionary act, however we understand that phrase, is extremely odd. I think that in the United Kingdom, the question of whether or not Christians should follow their Messiah, who was in a very important way political, has now somewhat receded into the background. I don't think that's really contested anymore. What I think is contested is how they should go about that. I just want to think for a moment about why that perhaps isn't a sharper question in the UK as it has been elsewhere in the world. Perhaps establishment is something to do with that, the establishment of the Church of England. I'll make some more comments on that in a moment, but perhaps also the heritage of William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect, and also the Christian socialists, people like Charles Kingsley and F.D. Morris. It's often said, of course, that the Labour Party in the UK owes more to Methodism than to Marx. Perhaps the sort of Victorian social reformers, people like Elizabeth Fry. I would also want to, in modern times, argue strongly that for the influence of the work of John Stott, and also of any number of organizations that were in various ways influenced by his work. I think that his arguments about Christian political involvement or social involvement have been extremely influential, and I know that many people will agree with that. As the diversity of the speakers on the panel tonight suggests, though, the question of the how of Christian political engagement is a profoundly contextual question. I think there are some contextual factors that we in the West, if you like, share, or the Anglosphere, but there are also profound differences. The UK and the US are for me some two very an interesting contrasting pair. So the US has a strict separation of church and state, yet religion is like this third rail of American politics, and a charge which can be used both negatively and positively. Whereas in the UK, we have a context where one Christian tradition is still privileged constitutionally above others, but there is a much stronger assumed secularism, if you like, a kind of cultural secularism. So in my comments, I want to address firstly a kind of what we might share, that wider theological horizon, but also how we might differ and speak specifically about the UK. So I really want to echo some comments that I think it was Dali made at the beginning of the evening. I think evangelicalism has had a kind of a heart failure. There is an evangelical theological problem. And I speak as an evangelical, and it's really about that kind of plain old desire of evangelicalism to get souls into heaven, which I think is a sub-biblical vision. And but it is the framework in which we get to play off evangelism and social action, or evangelism and socio-political action. We emphasize verbal proclamation and witness, but about what? That's the question. What is the content of the gospel? Now, I'm making these comments very quickly and in a very unguarded way. But of course, if we address the actual content of Scripture, then we discover just how little of it is about our kind of post-mortem destination, you know, what happens to us when we die. I think recently was preaching through 1 Corinthians in my own church, and that is a letter not about the soul, but about the body. The Greek word soma The body occurs 46 times in that letter. And throughout the letter, the Apostle Paul is talking about the state of our bodies, the nature of our bodies, the future of our bodies, and how our bodies can be driven by either the flesh or the spirit. But this evangelical kind of habit of a kind of spirit-body dualism has taken us to a politics which is, I think, sin-driven rather than gospel-driven. That is, it's even when we've done politics, it's been driven by a concern about a small range of moral issues which are seen as signs of a kind of cultural disgrace, the absence of grace. And there is a corresponding underemphasis on the liberating potential of the gospel and how it addresses the structures of sin and its larger manifestations and how it goes about the work of redemption. And even evangelicals, I would say, who see themselves as socially engaged, have often been so in quite a paternalistic way, and kind of accepting the kind of mores and the kind of structure of society as it is, recognizing that some experience something of a disadvantage and it wants to give them a leg up rather than addressing the kind of structural questions that are the cause of those disadvantages. So those are kind of, I think I'm shooting it from the hip a bit, but I think there is a theological problem within evangelicalism that still enables us, even in 2022, to be asking questions about is it right for us to be engaged in social and political action or addressing social and political concerns. Part of me wants to say, why are we still having that discussion? Here in the UK, now to turn specifically to some comments about the UK, I just want to say that I really honour those of you who have spoken tonight who serve and are serving under incredible pressures. But when we address the question of church and society in the UK, we have to address almost the obverse of that, which is the establishment of the Church of England, which is this privilege that is still afforded one Christian tradition against other Christian traditions and against other religions and against the kind of secular. But this establishment has counterintuitive and I think deleterious effects on Christian political witness. I've already said that in spite of that apparent privilege, there's a strong current of cultural secularism, the assumption that we don't do God, as Tony Blair's press chief once said to a journalist. Some theorists even argue in favor of establishment precisely because it has a sort of moderating effect on religion. It might take the edge off and make it a kind of more civil and polite thing. There is also, of course, a kind of wider hostility in the UK. It's harder and harder for fairly mainstream Christians to occupy high political office. Theos, the organisation that I work for, exists in part to push back against some of those things. All that said, I think we in the UK are still afflicted and confused by the feeling that we have a position that we might lose, and therefore we have something that it is our job to defend. And Christian politics in the UK, now thinking broadly of the kind of evangelical end of things, has not been good at handling pluralism or engaging with some of the challenges from more recent movements of justice, like the Black Lives Matter campaign. We're in effect still acting like a landowner who's trying to chase away trespassers into the public square. This primes us, I think, as Craig suggested in his paper, to align our status quo in all sorts of ways. We are instinctively rather than thoughtfully conservative. Don't think there's anything wrong with being conservative, but I think we're instinctively conservative rather than reasoning our way to that position. And I think our posture could be far more reconciled both to pluralism and open to the possibility that there are deep injustices in our society that we do need to contend with as Christians. And those are things that we do try and embody in our work at Theos. So just what might that look like? And I've said loosely that I think there is a problem within evangelical theology itself, that it's set up in a way to kind of create a bifurcation between gospel witness and evangelism and social and political action. So I do think we need to borrow from other traditions. I will quote from Rowan Williams, where he talks about in his book, For the Common Good, what is it that turns a society into a community? He says, the political challenges that I've enumerated are rooted in a very strong moral sense of what human beings are, what they are for, what they are capable of, what, as a theologian, I'd call an anthropology, a doctrine of human nature. And I'm more and more persuaded that it's impossible to have anything resembling an intelligent discussion in that political and social realm without struggling to clarify what we actually believe about human beings. So I, end quote, I would argue that in our Christian political witness, we need to move from the discussion, which is in a kind of secondhand way about what Christianity does, to a kind of Christian political idea. That we need to move away from saying things about Christianity to saying Christian things, if I can put it that way. We have to reconstruct and renew and work out of what we at Theos call a kind of Christian humanism. That is a Christian account of what it is to be human. And I think the urgency and the hope that we have is that that Christian humanism will be a kind of prophetic dream to offer against the nightmares of this age. That we can argue that human beings are created, that they're ontologically and ethically dependent on their creator. We can argue against that dualism, which is, of course, not just a problem in Christianity, but we think about things like transhumanism and technological enhancement of the human, or indeed the transgender movement. So against dualism, we argue that we are material. Against materialism, we argue that we are open to transcendence, that we are worshipping animals, homo liturgicus, against attempts to reconstruct the world according to whatever truth we find most convenient, cf. Vladimir Putin. We are truth-seeking animals and able to locate truth. Against environmental nihilism, we must argue that we exercise kingship and stewardship over creation, and that we bear responsibility and accountability for it. And against rampant individualism, we argue that we are relational beings orientated to relationships of gift and reciprocity. So these are the kinds of things I'm actually quite hopeful about a Christian politics in at a moment when, of course, political ideology is kind of fragilized. It's kind of, all these things are broken up and there is no coherent, nobody's really telling a coherent story about either what it is to be human or what our kind of hope as political societies can be. I do think we have a very powerful story to tell, and we need to go about telling it. So thank you. I'll draw my comments to a close there.